The boy hated to see his father in such a state, but there was nothing for it. His daddy was sitting on the porch with a heavy jug of whiskey cradled in the crook of his arm, like a baby, as he looked out hopelessly at the dying crops of the field. It was his bounty, and his shame. It hadn't been his fault, but he had only himself to blame. The boy was blameless in all this, but that didn't change the fact that he too would suffer. He was an unwilling passenger on this ride, though he didn't think his father knew that he knew that. His crops had been planted a little too early, a slight oversight on his father's part, but he believed it would be fine. The almanac says it'll be okay, he had said, with a shrug as if to remind himself that the seeds were already in the ground, so there was nothing for it now. What would be, and what was, unfortunately was. The rain that had fallen 3 weeks later hadn't been in the almanac either. The August rains had been heavy that year, coming down constantly for nearly a week. They had saturated the earth too much. You would say that water would be a good thing. The boy had thought his daddy would be happy for the rain. But he had spent most of his days watching the rain and drinking sourly. Daddy wasn't like some of his friends' fathers. They got drunk and they beat his friends. They got drunk and they got mean. Daddy didn't do that, though. When Daddy drank, he got sad. He sat quietly on the porch and looked at the swollen and rotten vegetables as they bloated in the field. Bloated as his tears that rolled down his face and pattered on his shirt. When the crops had begun to grow despite the heavy rainfall, Daddy had been hopeful. Maybe they'd be okay. Maybe the corn and beans and tomatoes and such would come in after all, and the money they made would be enough to pay the tax man so they could keep their land for another year. Daddy would still have to go back to the mill, of course, but maybe this would be the year that he could cut his hours down to part-time and spend more time doing something he loved, like tilling the land. But when it began to grow, Daddy's hopes had begun to rot on the vine as well. The vegetables looked rotten, their skin discolored and spotted. Most of it proved inedible. Daddy's friends had told him that he'd have to rip it out and plant again. The ground was fertile, rain-fed, and would grow new crops if he planted them. He would have to do it right away. He couldn't waste any time, because if he waited even a little bit, he wouldn't be able to harvest them before winter came. His daddy, however, had fallen into despair. He'd been like this since last winter. He'd been like this since Mama had taken ill and passed in mid-December. The boy didn't like to think about that. Mama had been their rock, and without her, Daddy had seemed lost and unable to find his path. He tried to farm, tried to work, tried to bring things back to normal, but then he would find something of hers, something that he had missed, and he would fall into a powerful sadness all over again. The crops were just the newest element of his sadness. Mama had loved the farm, had loved to grow things. Often while Daddy was working in the mill, the boy and his mother would go to the field and tend the crops. The money they brought in helped the family, and Mama liked to be of help to Daddy. The boy wished that she were here now. Daddy could use a help now, more than he ever needed one before. Daddy could use a help that the boy might be able to give him. As Daddy sat on the porch and wept, the boy set out to get him that help. The boy had a name, as most people do, but he had come to think of himself as the boy over the past year since his mother's death. His daddy had stopped calling him by his name, just calling him boy or the boy when he spoke about him. Sometimes the boy sat by himself and whispered his own name to himself, touching his lips as the name sounded foreign to his ears, and made them tingle with each repetition. Sometimes when he went to school, his teacher would call his name 3 or 4 times before he would remember that it belonged to him. Sometimes it felt like the boy who owned that name was a different person, a person who had died along with his mother, and his father was the only one who realized it. The boy walked into the woods behind the farmhouse without fear, wanting only to be done with this task so that Daddy might be happy again, so that he could stop crying and begin acting like himself. In the depths of his heart, he somehow believed that if his father wasn't sad, then his mother would come back from heaven or wherever she had gone to, and they could all be happy again. He was old enough to know better, but the heart has a way of tricking us into being hopeful. He was old enough to know that magic wasn't real, but the presence of the altar was something that flew in the face of that knowledge. The altar was something he had discovered after his mother had died. He'd spent a winter in the house with his wraith of a father. He'd found excuses to be out of that house, his father standing at the window of his bedroom and looking out at the field much as he had when the rain started. The boy often felt that he was living in a haunted house, and the boy had begun exploring the woods in a way he hadn't since he was very young. His father was disinterested in chores that had once been a rude clock for both of them, and the boy found he had time for activities that he had once discarded. He was walking the skeletal trails of January wood when he had first found the altar. It was in a part of the woods that he had never come to before, a part too far for him to come to comfortably. It was over a mile from the farm, and the boy didn't dare go too far, lest he be missed. Now that there was no one to miss him, however, the boy found that he had time to range farther than ever before. He had fled from it at first, hearing the strange voices that shivered against him like winter breeze. But he found he returned there more often as the voices whispered for him to come and see. The voices led him to a strange collection of stones, something not formed by any tectonic movement that he was aware of. The shapes had been wrought by the hands of a madman, and the angles were rude and mesmerizing. Inside the altar was a tiny house, a small cottage with windows that seemed to glow if he looked at it. It was all nestled within a grove of skeletal vines and thorny branches. The boy had ducked beneath them carefully, not wanting to get pricked, and it almost appeared that someone had been trying to hide it behind all that spiky greenery. The whispery voice had cheered him on every step of the way, and as he finally stood before the beautiful monstrosity, he heard them clearly for the first time. They told him they were the remains of a forgotten religion, a shrine to a misplaced deity, and with the boy's help, they could be again. The boy listened. The boy absorbed their words, and the more he heard, the more he wanted to hear. He returned many times that winter, cutting back the vines and cleaning up the altar as he tried to make the space holy once more. The boy had never been religious before. His parents had attended church, but none of them had been what you would call devout. As the voice washed over him, though, he felt and saw the importance in a way he never had before. He spent a lot of time at the altar, listening to the voices, hearing the history of the forgotten god it represented. They told of a strange place, a place outside of time, a place where the Green Man did battle with the Pale Lady, his eternal enemy. The two were locked in a struggle as old as time itself, and would likely be intertwined until the universe collapsed. The boy found that he liked listening to the stories, leaning his head against the altar and feeling the vibrations in his bones. Once spring came, however, his father needed him in the field, and he was able to spend less time in the woods. He still maintained the altar, and still visited when he could find the time, but he was lucky to get to the spot once or twice a week. The voices thanked him for helping them, and the boy continued to listen to their history. He heard about places strange and foreign, and his mind was open to the possibilities of something beyond his simple town and simple life. His family had existed in Frazier for generations. The farm they owned had been his great-great-great-great-grandfather's reward for surviving the Civil War and being allowed to return home mostly whole. None of them had ever gone far from the home. His father had a brother who had gone to college, a brother who lived far away and rarely visited, but most of the family lived close and rarely went beyond the borders of their own farm. Suddenly, the boy longed to see these places. Fortunately, the voice told him how this could be. Unfortunately, the boy knew that he couldn't leave his father right now, no matter what the voices said. His daddy had just lost Mama, and the boy often found himself cooking for him so he would eat. His father might very well waste away without him. He wanted to go, but he was torn between the unknown and the real tragedy of watching his father suffer. The voices assured him that there was time, that they would be here when the time was right, and promised the boy a boon for his efforts. "When the time is right, we will grant you anything your heart desires, but only when you are ready to give yourself fully to our cause." The boy had noticed that the voice was not as strong as it had been when spring came around, and in summer it was little more than a spidery whisper. The growth came back stronger during the hot months, some of it seeming to grow back overnight, and the boy had to be diligent to keep it cut back. He didn't mind. The altar had become his joy in life, and he longed for the times he spent there. The stones told him how they appreciated his tending of them, and as summer waned and fall began, the voices built in strength again. That was good, because the boy had been worried that something had happened to it. As it came back to life at the end of the hot months, it began to tell him again how he could have his reward, and more, if only he would take his place at the side of the green. The boy had resisted, but after watching his father's suffering, he felt he was ready to accept his boon. As the boy came upon the glen where the altar lay, he knew now that the time had come. The voices welcomed him and rejoiced at his return, and when he made his request, they asked if that was all. "Yes," the boy told them, "I just want my daddy to be happy again. I want his crops to grow. I want him to feel hopeful. I want him to stop crying. Please," he begged, before the alien receptacle, "make my daddy happy, and I'll help you in whatever it is you need." The voices chattered amongst themselves, and when they returned, they agreed to help the boy. They agreed, and they gave him a token to wear, a token of their Lord's favor. "Put it on and come with us, for there is much preparation to make." As the gourd slid over his head, the boy was at peace. As his voice filled his head, the boy forgot his name in true and became a vessel for the green. Daniel Mossel awoke the next morning to find that a miracle had happened as he slept. He stretched the ache from his muscles, the cost of sleeping on the porch in October, and discovered that the bloated and worthless vegetables that would likely make up his late-season crop had been replaced by hale and hardy plants that would likely survive the depths of winter. Corn so crisp you could taste it with your eyes. Beans hardy enough to grace a dozen tables. Squash and yams and potatoes and things he didn't even remember planting, and all of it ripe and ready for harvest. He had been as amazed as the boy had been, but as he set to picking, something seemed wrong. Someone should be here with him. Someone should be helping him with these vegetables. But he couldn't think who. His mind immediately went to his wife, but she couldn't help him now. She was dead, had been dead for half a year and more, and it was only ever just the two of them. He wished he'd had a son to help him now, a son to carry his legacy when his bones were in the ground, but wishful thinking would no more make him a son than it would bring the harvest in, and Daniel set to his job. He was already counting the money that Wayne Hauser would hand him at the farmer's market after he loosed his long, low whistle at the sight of all that gleaming produce in the back of his truck. From the edge of the field, the boy looked on through the diamonds of his new eyes. He smiled beneath his pumpkin head, the coquettish mouth turned up in a stitched-on grin. His father was happy, happier than he had been in a long time, and he would be happy for the rest of his days. The green man would see to his happiness now. The boy was certain of that. And when the voices called him back to the woods, the boy went without hesitation. Fall was already upon them, and winter would be here before they knew it. It was time to get started. The green would be served, and the green man would be honored. This would be a Halloween that Frazier would never forget. Good evening, everyone. It's me, Dr. Plague. Thank you so much for joining me for tonight's video. If you still feel like you could do with a little more spooky in your life, why not click on one of the videos that's appearing on your screen? If you're not subscribed, why not go ahead and subscribe so you don't miss any of the stories we put on here. I make new videos 7 days a week, and I wouldn't want you to miss a one of them. So if you'd like to support the channel, why not go ahead and subscribe? Maybe hit that notification bell so you don't miss any of the great stuff we do here. And of course, if you'd like to support the channel in a more financial way, you could always become a member on YouTube or on Patreon. Spooky Skeletons, that's my $5 members, always get their videos early as opposed to in the evening. And we've got lots of other cool stuff that you can take advantage of. Just go down to Patreon and give it a look, or become a member on YouTube. Speaking of all of our wonderful patrons and YouTube members, let's go ahead and thank them right now. Thanks to Unicorn Hollow, our Spooky Ghost contributor. Thanks to our Spooky Skeleton contributors, Janice, Lee Kendall, and Saikat. Thanks to our Ghostly Reader contributors, Hi Stacy, Winter, Xaronan, Emily Coltsfoot, Stephanie Carrington, Tyler Parker, Cinnamon Fox, and Sarah Samar 42. Thanks, guys. We just couldn't do the show without you. Again, if you'd like to support the show in a more monetary fashion, there are links below to Patreon, and you can just go to YouTube and click on membership, if that's something that interests you. There's also links to my latest book below if you'd like to go have a look on Amazon. It should show you the other books I've got as well, so why not go ahead and get the whole collection. And as always, thanks for stopping by. Dr. Plague, signing off. Have a wonderful evening.